Rookies Billy Bowman and Xavier Watts' potential emergence as starters this summer could transform this Falcons secondary.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast, coming up on year 9 here on the Locked On Podcast Network this Thanksgiving. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers of this pod. And all you got to do, what basically being an everydayer means, you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we're going to talk about the big position battles as we are a few days away from the start of training camp, looking at the 2 starting spots technically up for grabs for this Falcon team heading into camp at the nickel and cornerback position and safety spot. Tomorrow we might get into some of those depth battles that are maybe overlooked, but let's start. And then later in today's episode, we'll also talk about, the possibility of the Falcons picking up a third tight end, a high-profile third tight end, and why that doesn't make any sense. But let's start with the nickel cornerback competition, which is going to be key. There's a potential 3-way competition, possibly even a 4th cornerback might be in the mix. And before we break that down, we got to ask the big topic and big question is, why does this matter? And it matters because this Falcons secondary was a problem last year. Maybe not as big a problem as the Falcons pass rush, which has been a sore spot for this team for 2 decades. Just as long as I've been covering the team. Maybe I'm the problem, right? Maybe I'm the curse when it comes to the Falcons pass rush. And because of that, the pass rush gets the majority of the attention. But what didn't get a lot of attention, because we've spent so much time complaining about the Falcons pass rush, and hopefully the Falcons have resolved that or gotten closer to resolving that with the investments they made this offseason in terms of the pass rush. But what didn't get a lot of attention was the Falcons secondary getting exposed a few too many times too often last year. We've talked about a number of times where anytime this defense played a team that had, at least 2, let's say top 32 wide receivers, depending on, but basically quality wide receivers, like in the Seattle game, like the Vikings game, like the first Tampa Bay game, the secondary got exposed. And there's a couple of matchups this upcoming season where if that trend continues, they could have similar issues, right? Tampa Bay in week 1, Minnesota potentially in week 2. We'll see if Jordan Addison is suspended, and that may impact that. But Washington, now that they've added Deebo Samuel late in the season, with the Rams, now that they have Puka Nacua and Devontae Adams, Miami in the middle of the season with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, although, there's been rumors for months now that Tyreek Hill's time in Miami will be coming to an end soon. So we'll see if the Falcons dodge that bullet, as they often do, where they'll trade Tyreek Hill before the Falcons play the Dolphins or something like that. But, I know this is something that's rare on this podcast, but let's be positive for once and optimistic for once. Let's imagine the Falcons are a playoff team. This issue could rear its ugly head in January, where if and when they're facing teams like Philadelphia and Detroit, right? Dallas, Chicago have now added more weapons to their arsenal. And I know you're probably sitting there like, Dallas and Chicago aren't playoff teams. Well, if you go to FanDuel, their playoff odds currently are higher than the Atlanta Falcons at this point in time. So at least the possibility exists out there, right? If the possibility that the Falcons make the playoffs exists out there. So the question is, has this problem been solved? And, the Falcons are essentially running it back with the same cornerback group. And they just added Billy Bowman, who's technically not really a true corner. He's really a safety. But that gets us to, this competition at that nickel cornerback spot where this is where the Falcons are hoping this new addition in Billy Bowman is going to really move the needle for this football team. And I think it's fair to consider Billy Bowman potentially the front runner at this position. I personally do. I know others may see, the incumbent in D. Alford potentially as the front runner. They may see Clark Phillips, the Falcons 2023 fourth round pick, as potentially the front runner at this spot. But it probably is going to be one of those three. You can throw a fourth name into the mix. Potentially, I've seen some people do that. That would be Natron Brooks, who's been on the Falcons practice squad the last couple of years. And while I don't necessarily consider Brooks a competitor to be the starter, not because I have doubts in his ability to potentially win a competition fair or square, but I don't think it's going to be a fair competition because the Falcons have a vested interest in giving those opportunities to, one of the two players that is either a fourth round pick, while Natron Brooks is formerly an undrafted free agent, right? And Bowman and Phillips being fourth round picks, or the guy that's started 2 years in the NFL, 2+, I guess 2.5 years, if you could argue, with D. Alford at that nickel cornerback's position, even though you could argue Brooks' skill set may apply best to this position compared to the other guys because he's the most physical tackler of this quartet of players. He's also a little bit taller, a little bit longer than these guys, and at least theoretically, based off of that, you could imagine maybe he'd be a little bit better of a matchup against the different types of slot receivers that he would face at that nickel cornerback position. Although I think the other three guys are definitely better athletes than Natron Brooks at this point in time. And so even short kings and guys with T-Rex arms, like the other three guys, may be able to keep up better with some of those better wide receivers that they may be facing in the slot. But, I'm very eager to see how this competition breaks down over the course of the summer. Again, I think I would, as we sit here today, would bet on Bowman winning, but, it's really anybody's position, right? But the main reason I bet on Bowman is because this regime, specifically this coaching staff, has much more of a vested interest in him because he's this coaching staff's fourth round pick, as opposed to Clark Phillips being the last coaching staff's fourth round pick. And, of that trio, I think even though Billy Bowman has those baby T-Rex arms that are going to contribute to some ups and downs potentially as a tackler, he does have the demeanor to potentially make up for it, meaning that, there are going to be some physical limitations that Billy Bowman is going to have to overcome, which I think potentially could lower his ceiling as a nickel cornerback in that way, particularly when it comes to the run support aspect of it, which is why you've heard me sort of suggest I see Bowman more as a short-term stopgap option at nickel cornerback than necessarily a long-term solution, just because, I think you could find a player theoretically that is a more proven corner and probably also has the physical tools that, again, you like as a matchup that would have, in theory, a higher ceiling than Billy Bowman long-term at that spot. But I think you can kind of overcome some of these issues if you just play like an absolute psychopath. And that's what I think Billy Bowman is going to need if he's going to be that long-term solution at the nickel cornerback position. And I think of this group, he's the guy that is the most psychopathic, has the most sort of competitive toughness, or whatever you want to call it, to sort of make up for those physical limitations. There are times, as we've described many times on this show, and we've had guests describe, he plays with his hair on fire. Right. He's not the sort of cool, calm, collective, finesse guy or whatever, if you want to call it that. He's a guy that, can play with a little psychopathy. So we'll see if that gives Billy Bowman the edge. I think it probably will, but we'll see. Now, Phillips is also intriguing in the mix. You can recall me saying when we drafted Clark Phillips that if he's going to be a starter in this league, it's going to have to be as a nickel, just because I don't think he has the physical tools to match up as a full-time outside corner. And I think because of that, like, this summer is going to be his golden opportunity to, and potentially his last chance to really break through to become more than what he has been so far in 2 years, which has been a solid backup, but hasn't been able to break through up to this point. And then when you look at D. Alford, he gave this team 2 years or 1.5 years of good production from 22 and 23 as the nickel cornerback. Struggled mightily last year. I would imagine probably the first day of training camp, he'll be taking the majority of the reps with the ones, because that's just usually how it works in the NFL. The most experienced guy starts out camp as the starter, but oftentimes we know that guy doesn't necessarily in camp as the starter. And we've seen instances where a guy will start with the ones day one of training camp and then get benched on day two and start working with the twos on day two of training camp. I think back to John Asamoah back in 2015, and then it was James Stone on day two. That's the prominent example, but I'm dating myself with that one. But I wouldn't be completely shocked if Alford won the job. Um, I think the team has a vested interest in Bowman and Phillips usurping him, unseating him. But I wouldn't be shocked if him, because he's more proven in terms of the cornerback position, and particularly being the more proven option in man coverage, which we expect to see more of that this season with Jeff Ulbrich taking over the defense than we saw last season. But I think the team is probably looking for any excuse to move off of D. Alford, and so if he does win it, that competition, that to me is less an endorsement of D. Alford and more an indictment of, I guess, Clark Phillips and Billy Bowman. So, I think Alford's at a point where, if he doesn't win the starting spot, he's definitely in danger of being cut. So it's kind of an all or nothing summer for him. So we'll see what he does, and we'll see how it all plays out. But, if I'm putting odds on it, as we sit here a few days ahead of training camp, if you're asking me who I think is going to be the week one starter at nickel cornerback and put numbers, again, pulling these numbers out of my butt, my best guess is 40% chance is Billy Bowman, 30% chance is Clark Phillips, 25% chance is D. Alford, and then 5% chance it's the field, whether that's Natron Brooks, somebody else, or, a free agent to be signed at a later date, or even, Mike Hughes, if you go out there and get another outside corner or something like that. So 5% chance of that going down. So overall, Billy Bowman, I think, is the front runner, but we'll see on that. And now that we've looked at the competition at nickel cornerback, let's talk about the competition for that second starting safety spot and see if third round pick Xavier Watts is the solution to the Falcons' problems at that position. So today we're talking about our sponsor, Rugiette, and since we pump so much Penix on this podcast, things like medications like Viagra and Cialis can help us there. But if you're looking for something beyond the usual pill to help you pump, it's time to be Rugiette Ready. Rugiette Ready is the next-gen prescription treatment designed to amplify arousal in the brain and boost blood flow. Unlike the usual pills that can take hours, Rugiette's 3-in-1 formula dissolves under your tongue, kicks in fast, on average in just 15 minutes, and the effects can last up to 36 hours, so you can stay confident and in control of your pump when the moment is right. So get your pump on by heading to rugiette.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL to get 15% off today. That's RUGIET.com/LockedOnNFL and use promo code LockedOnNFL for 15% off. Individual results may vary with prescription treatment. Compounded drugs are permitted to be prescribed under federal law, but are not FDA approved and do not undergo FDA safety, effectiveness, and manufacturing review. Please visit Rugiette website for full safety information. So who's going to be the starter next to Jessie Bates this season? And again, I think Xavier Watts is my bet. He has been my bet since he was drafted. He's a high floor safety with very good coverage instincts and offers a similar skill set to what Justin Simmons brought to the table last year. I'm not suggesting that he's going to be the all-pro that Justin Simmons was at the peak of his powers in Denver, but certainly maybe the more diminished version of Justin Simmons, which, again, as you've heard me say on the podcast in recent weeks, you can argue was a B- type of player last year, if you don't negatively judge him for the expectations that he was going to be this A+ player from a lot of us. But, I think Watts is competing with the likes of Jordan Fuller, the veteran, as well as potentially Kevin King and DeMarco Hellams. I mentioned King because our guy Joe Patrick of 92.90 Game mentioned King and Fuller splitting starting reps during some of the May practices back in late May. And, the Falcons essentially used King as a safety last year in their dime sub packages when they went to 6 DBs, where he was pretty much exclusively asked to cover tight ends in that situation. So functioning like you would ask a safety tight end eraser type of player. But as we discussed when we broke down the safety group on the pod, last week, hopefully Kevin King's not in the mix because, I think the only reason he's getting those reps because he's the only returning guy from last year's group because Justin Simmons is no longer here. DeMarco Hellams is coming off an injury and going back to what I said, the guys that have been here start out with getting the reps with the ones, and the other guys have to come in and earn it or take it from him. So hopefully someone will be coming soon to take Kevin King's job. Sorry, Kevin King, but it is what it is. But I think where, unlike cornerback, where we're looking kind of at a zero-sum game where only one of those guys is going to win a spot and get opportunity to play, I think the guys that may not even win the starting safety spot will still have opportunities to get some playing time this upcoming season, just because the Falcons might be using big nickel. That was something that the Jets utilized somewhat. I won't overestimate how often they used it, but it was a package when Jeff Ulrich was a DC these last couple of years. Big nickel, for those of you not familiar, is when you use 5 defensive backs, but instead of the traditional 3 corners and 2 safeties, you use 3 safeties and 2 corners. And you could technically argue, if Billy Bowman does win the starting nickel cornerback spot, that the Falcons are playing big nickel because he's technically considered a safety, although I don't know if we're going to see him get a ton of reps at safety this year, but we'll see on that front. But it's not something the Jets used a ton of. The data and the numbers I've seen indicate that it was their usage was somewhere between like 6 and 8% these last couple of years in terms of big nickel usage. So it's more of a tool in their tool belt that they often utilize, from what I can tell watching the film, against 2 tight end sets when they wanted to still have guys that could cover against teams that would throw out of their 2 tight end sets, as opposed to playing base defense, which is what a lot of teams play when they see that 12 personnel or 2 tight end sets. But I think whoever loses the starting competition, which presumably will be either Fuller or Helms, based off of my assessment, would be the front runner for that 3rd safety spot. And we've talked before about how Helms's potential as a run defender makes him a good fit in that role. Not to mention the fact that Helms was arguably on verge of starting before his injury that he suffered in the first preseason of action of last summer. I think Fuller could also handle the big nickel responsibilities since he's a decent run defender. I don't think he's as good as Helms, but I think, he's probably the 2nd best run defender of this entire safety group. I think those guys are a little bit more limited than Xavier Watts when it comes to sort of the deep coverage that we're expecting that second safety to often get tasked with doing, which is why we're so high on Xavier Watts. He's only second to Jessie Bates when it comes to the deep coverage ability. Helms has never been a great deep coverage guy, mostly because he doesn't necessarily lack the ideal instincts and range there. Fuller is less about instincts. It's just a lack of speed and range at that position. And, I think those 2 guys, Helms and Fuller, make sense as a big nickel, just because that big nickel often plays in the box, or at least that's how the Jets often utilize Ashton Davis, who served that big nickel role as their 3rd safety for most of the last 2 seasons. And so, we'll see what that competition looks like. But when we talk about the secondary overall, whether we're talking about the nickel corner or the safety position, the Falcons are potentially counting on these 2 rookies and or other new starters at this position, particularly at the safety position, to upgrade this unit. And you're hoping, coupled with the improved pass rush, that's going to take some of the pressure off of this safety. That's where you can feel a little bit more optimistic about, okay, well, we can get something out of these rookies more so than we would normally get out of a rookie, because that pass rush is going to be able to get home a little bit more. And again, that's probably a topic we'll discuss more tomorrow. So we'll see if that happens. We'll see how quickly guys like Watts and Bowman can get up to speed. But revisiting a conversation we had yesterday, talking about, these 4 rookies on defense that the Falcons drafted this year, including Watts and Bowman, along with Jalen Walker and James Pierce, as well as the 3 second-year players, and Ruka Roro, Brandon Doris, and Braylon Trice, who barely played last year, that are essentially de facto rookies based off of that, and talking about, who among these guys are going to get, 500 plus snaps this upcoming season, which is an indicator of a guy that was a significant contributor or a regular contributor to your defense. And again, like, if I'm betting, again, putting money on it, I got to find out if they got FanDuel odds at this. But I think the safest bet of those 7 guys is probably Xavier Watts. He would be, in my opinion, the safest bet to reach 500 snaps. I would put the odds of him winning the safety spot at around 50%, right? It's kind of a coin toss, but 50% I think is pretty good odds considering who he's competing with. I would probably put Jordan Fuller next on that at 35%. Helms, to me, is probably only at 10%. I really do kind of think Helms is only really destined to be that 3rd safety at best, but there's a slim chance again because last year the team, seemed to think highly enough for him to start before he got injured. But now that they've added, more bodies at that position, it kind of tells you not going to necessarily rest on their laurels at that point in time. And so that would leave about, I think 5% of my math is off, is accurate for the field at the safety position. And that's the Kevin King conversation, or potentially, I don't know. I don't even know who the other safety is on the roster. Like they cut Benny Sapp, they cut Micah Abernathy, Josh Thompson, I think is the other safety. So whoever that would be. But, I think when we talk about guys getting 500 plus snaps, if Watts is my best bet, Bowman would then be my next best bet because I think he's got the best odds of winning that nickel cornerback spot. And then that would be followed by Pearson Walker. And then of last year's guys, in terms of guys that potentially could hit 500 plus snaps, Rook, I think, would have the best shot at that. And so I kind of project all of those guys, Pierce Walker and Rook, to be somewhere between like 300 and 500 snaps this upcoming season. That's why, and again, I just think it's just the nature of having a deeper rotation up front that's going to limit those guys from playing the 600, 700 snaps that you typically expect out of a true starter in that D-line rotation. But we'll see how that all plays out. Again, that may be something we can dive deeper into on tomorrow's episode. But, hopefully the Falcons, as they are being quote unquote intentional with playing these rookies on the field, I think it's a good call, whether we're talking about the safety or cornerback position. We need to, I've talked about this before, but we need to see what this, how stocked is this cupboard in terms of young talent as we, this season, so that we can kind of figure out, how to evaluate GM Terry Fontenot and his status moving forward, because, we really need to see these draft picks play in order to be able to do that. And so basically any tie or any close competition, in my opinion, should go to the rookie or the young player that the Falcons have invested draft picks into. And even in a world where, the Falcons do wind up making the playoffs this year, there's a lot of potential areas that the Falcons are going to have to plug in the next couple of off seasons. And so you want to have a good opinion of Terry Fontenot, even if the team has success, over whether or not he's the man to do the job long term. Because again, I feel like his approach to the draft of having that quote unquote conviction and trading up is not going to be something that's going to be conducive to this team's long-term success. Maybe that's the thing that helps this team get over the hump this season, but in terms of sustained success over the next couple of years, I do think, trading back, which, that will be a challenge in of itself for Terry Fontenot. And I don't know if he'll be able to help himself in that regard, but at least you can say, hey, because he's hit on some of these draft picks, or at least more of these draft picks, that's what you want to have that answer by the end of the season, so that you can say, okay, even if we can somehow convince Terry to not trade up in the draft anymore, he's the man for we still have confidence in his ability to find the talent wherever he picks in the draft. And so you want to have that question answered. You don't want to have that conversation that we've been having for, the better part of 5 years on, where it's just like, is Terry Fontenot a good GM? I don't know. We just have to keep waiting and seeing, because we don't really know based off of the results so far. So I don't want that to be a conversation. I want to be a definitive yes or a definitive no by the end of the season. And I think the only way that you find that out is by playing some of these young guys. So that's my thoughts on that. But, the conviction I have on Terry Fontenot is, pales in comparison to the conviction I have and why the Locked On Falcons podcast is the best there is, because, I hear so many people talk about the Falcons should be signing a new tight end, and that doesn't make any sense. And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So this is an ad by BetterHelp. Workplace stress is at an all-time high. 61% of the global workforce is reporting higher than normal stress levels, and this summer is the perfect time to take small steps to focus on your wellness and manage the challenges that come with your workday. And of course, most of us can't just quit our jobs or take endless vacations, but we can start small, whether it's getting outside for a few minutes, adding movement into your day, or talking to someone who can help you navigate life's challenges. And that's where BetterHelp comes in. Therapy just isn't for the tough times and traumas. It's a great tool for learning coping skills and setting boundaries. Therapy has helped me develop positive coping skills that make my day-to-day challenges easier to manage. And as the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a diverse variety of expertise. Unwind from work with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/locked on. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/locked on. And we love summer sports, don't we? And just because the NBA season is over and the NFL season has yet to begin doesn't mean that FanDuel still isn't the best way to get in all the action on baseball, soccer, golf, tennis, WNBA, NBA Summer League that is still going strong. And since you're already following the action, why not make it a little bit more thrilling with FanDuel? We're going to give you so many ways to win money, whether they're same game parlays, you want to bet the over-unders, the spread, all that stuff, how many homers is Ronald Acuna going to hit on any given day, the chances of the Hawks or the Dream making a run at the Eastern Conference or the Falcons making a deep postseason run. All of those options are available for you at FanDuel, and it's easy to use. It's fast to pay out, so why wait? And all you got to do is head on over to FanDuel.com or open the FanDuel app today to get started. And if you're new to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if and when your first bet wins. Again, bet $5. If it wins, you get $150 in bonus bets over at the FanDuel app today, or visit FanDuel.com to get started. So the Seahawks, I should say, cut their starting tight end or former starting tight end Noah Fant yesterday, and I saw a lot of Falcon fans online suggesting the Falcons should pursue him. And I apologize in advance now for my condescension that I'm going to show for the next 5 minutes on this podcast. But it feels like to me, tell me you don't watch the Falcons without telling me you don't watch the Falcons, right? Why would the Falcons pursue another tight end when they barely use the tight ends that they currently have? Now, if you're suggesting that the Falcons should pursue Noah Fant basically because you're also expecting the Falcons to trade Kyle Pitts any day now, okay, I can get that, right? Like if you get whatever you get for Kyle Pitts at this stage, probably like, I don't know, a 5th or 6th round pick, you save $11 million in cap space this upcoming season, then you sign Noah Fant on a discount, and it would have to be a discount at this point in time because he signed for $10.5 million a year ago with the Seahawks, had similar production this past year as Juwan Johnson with the Saints, who just signed a new contract for $10 million. You saw 2 blocking tight ends this offseason sign for more than $7 million a year on their contracts, and Josh Oliver and John Bates. And I say that is basically to set the market for what a starting tight end makes in the NFL. It's basically $8 to at least $10 million at minimum. And so if you're imagining you're going to sign Fant for a deep discount and make him the lowest paid starting tight end in the NFL, not on a rookie deal, okay. But, that's where the agency part of free agency gets stressed because, why would Noah Fant do that? He has a choice in that matter. But if we're imagining a situation where the Falcons continue to not use their tight ends, you could say, okay, well, why are we paying $11 million for Kyle Pitts and not using and getting our money's worth? And so if we can get, let's say Noah Fant's 80 to 90% the player that Kyle Pitts is based off of Kyle Pitts' current disappointing play, and we can get that for 50% the price, right? That's maybe potentially worthwhile. But, are you going to convince Noah Fant to take a well below market deal in order to make that happen? So that to me is the only reasoning behind maybe talking about the Falcons pursuing Noah Fant. But, in terms of going back to tell me you don't watch the Falcons without telling me you don't watch the Falcons, which is like the Falcons don't use multiple tight ends, right? In 14 games last year, they used 11 personnel with only one tight end on the field over 90% of their plays, right? The Falcons tight end 3, which is what I've seen people suggesting the Falcons should utilize Noah Fant as, their tight end 3 last year, which was Ross Dwelley, played 9% of the snaps. And most of those snaps came in either the Denver game where Charlie Warner missed that game and Ross Dwelley was essentially the tight end 2 that day, or in the second half of that Raiders game where the Falcons refused to throw the ball with Kirk Cousins and just kept running it, with 2 tight end sets with Warner and Ross Dwelley in the second half of that game. And so if you remove those 2 games from the data, like the tight end 3 was only on the field for like 4% of plays last year. And so how are you going to convince a guy like Noah Fant, who started over 80 games in the NFL, that he should join the Falcons as the tight end 3 just to play 3 snaps a game? So, you can say, okay, Fant's better than our current tight end 3 options in Felipe Franks and Tegan Quatoriano and Josh Simon. And we may be talking about that competition for that 3rd tight end spot on tomorrow's episode. But those current 3 options, as limited as they are perfectly suited to just play 3 snaps a game. That's all we need you for. We don't need a world beater at that spot. So again, I apologize for my condescension when I say this stuff, but this is why I'm so arrogant, guys, here on this illustrious podcast, right? This is why I'm the iron that sharpens the iron and all that nonsense. Because like I see when a player becomes available and people recognize the name, they're like, oh, the Falcons should sign him. And it reminds me of Doug the dog in the movie Up, where it's just like you're thinking about a thing and you're like a squirrel. It's like that's how I see so many fans when it comes to engaging with who the Falcons should sign. And so again, that's just an opportunity for me to advocate why Locked On Falcons should be your first listen, because we actually watch the film and we understand, like, hey man, we don't need to be spending $10 million on a tight end 3 to be playing 3 snaps a game at this point in time. And if you're like, well, we should expand our 3 tight end usage, like, okay, you're going to take Darnell Mooney off the field so that you can get Noah Fant and Charlie Warner more snaps. Like y'all sat here and told me 2 years ago that like Arthur Smith's offense was terrible. And now you're sitting here going like, let's just run 3 tight end sets all the time like Arthur Smith. It's like, what are we doing here, guys? So again, I don't get that stuff, but we will talk more about the tight end 3 position potentially tomorrow when we get into some of these lesser camp battles for some of these back end roster spots after focusing on the starting spots on today's episode, and potentially talk about how the pass rush is going to take pressure off of these young DBs that will be potentially playing a lot of snaps this year in the secondary. So that's all in store for you, along with the remaining condescension, whatever condescending thing I can get into on tomorrow's episode. So make Locked On Falcons if you want to be condescended to on a daily basis. Check out Locked On Falcons on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for your second listen, check out the top 100 Locked On Sports Today has unveiled the Locked On NFL Top 100. Go check it out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. It is all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.